15 книг, посвященных тому, что такое мозг, что такое разум, что такое сознание, как происходит кодирование в мозге, как соотносятся понятия мозга, разума и сознания. И его сегодняшняя лекция будет посвящена этим вопросам. Я очень рад приветствовать профессора Нортхоффа у нас в Московском университете.
Yeah, thank you very much, and Konstantin, thank you for the introduction, and also thank you for the invitation. And it's really a big honor for me to be here. We had a wonderful discussion already 2 days ago about certain dynamic principles of the brain, and we really see the brain in a similar way. So it's more sort of a Russian-German convergence than a Russian-Canadian convergence, because I'm originally from Germany. And I do think that the view of the brain, the way Konstantin and your Russian tradition does it, is key for understanding one of the main questions in science of our time: how brain and mind are connected. You obviously see and hear a lot in the media about this and fancy breakthroughs and this and that. However, let's be honest, we haven't really understood how brain and mind are related. We don't. We have a lot of data, but we don't really know what these data mean, and let alone we have a model of their relationship. So when I speak of the mind, for instance, why do you have a sense of boredom? You hear this Canadian with a strange German accent here, and you have a feeling of boredom. It's a subjective experience. Why does, and your brain's neuronal activity has certain firing patterns, but you don't know how your sense of boredom and your firing patterns are related. So in the history of neuroscience, and also in philosophy too, and also nowadays, always the mind has been considered special. Some very special properties, going back in the Western philosophy to Descartes, have been invoked. Here I will present you with an alternative approach. Very basic. The most basic features of our physical reality matter: time and space. So that's basically I probably have to. This is the technician. Can you? I don't know how this works. Maybe, okay, I need to do the next one. Is there any technician in the room who knows this?
What do you
or
want?
is it? I want the next slide.
Next slide.
Maybe, or you have another one, or just I. Yeah. So the question I want to address: how does neuronal activity transform into mental activity? Yeah. How is it possible? Ultimately, you want to read out of your mental states from your neuronal activity. Like, you go to the doctor, they collect your blood, and then they have a readout from your blood what kind of disease and symptoms you have. We are far away from that in neuroscience, and I'm also a psychiatrist, so I need that as a psychiatrist. Okay, great, thank you very much. Russian magic. Okay, and what we currently do is really a key point. We just focus on the upper level, the tip of the iceberg of the mind. Yeah, this is what we really do here. And, this is, yeah, we just focus on the upper layer, the conscious mind. Okay. Okay, sorry, I did it the wrong way. Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Thank you for the help. So the question is, how can we reach the deeper layers of our mind? The unconscious, the non-conscious, which is completely automatic. You have no control over that. Yeah? So this is what I'm targeting. I say that is key for understanding mental features. So my talk will basically revolve around this deeper layer down here. How can we access it? So I will have basically 4 different types, and unfortunately I do not have the kind of fancy and nice tools my predecessor had. Had I known that, I would have brought you some brains and some play tool brains. Too late? So I give you some example, little bit the theoretical background, why what is important. Because as you all know, when you do physics, you need a model. Yeah? And that holds for any kind of science. In biology, evolution, the evolution by Darwin is a model by means of which you can study empirical details about different species. We are lacking that model in the brain sciences. Yeah? There are different models around, and one predominant model is, you will see this in my talk, it's called the cognitive model. So then I will give you some examples of mental features, your sense of self. Then I will go a little bit into consciousness, and then I will show you some example of psychiatric disorders, like when you're depressed. So all these examples are about how neuronal activity transforms into mental activity. It's basically a very simple question, but hasn't really been addressed yet. And there's even a lot of discussion whether you can raise that question. Philosophers have discussed, can we really, is this question meaningful? I would have colleagues who said, no, the question is nonsense. So let me start, and this is a key feature for, maybe there are some philosophers here in the audience, and this is the philosophy of science, to set up the conceptual framework. Because as you know, any kind of science depends upon the models you have. Physics is a paradigmatic example for a model shift, and then you can take into view new phenomena. So here, what we currently have, it's sort of specified, we have what can be called a gap of contingency. So we do not have a relationship between mental features up here and neuronal features down here. We just don't know how they are related. Imagine you have the chemical formula of water, and then you have the liquid or the ice, and you don't know how they are related. You do not know that the liquid stuff is the same as the chemical formula of water. That's the situation in current neuroscience, and that's what I described here by the gap of contingency. And one reason for that is probably that we use different kinds of concepts. For instance, the mind is continuously changing. It's dynamic. Yeah? It's continuously changing. William James, American psychologist, spoke of a stream of consciousness. However, when we analyze the brain in a static way. We just analyze discrete time points instead of analyzing the flow of neuronal activity, the stream of neuronal activity. Yeah? Your mind, your consciousness is about a certain structure. However, and how different contents are related to each other. However, we investigate only the neuronal correlates of specific contents and not the relation between the contents. So we have a discrepancy between the mental features and the way we investigate the brain. So there's a methodological mismatch. So maybe you say, yeah, Northoff, very simple, just investigate the brain in terms of topography, meaning spatial organization, and dynamic changes from time point to time point. And that's exactly what I will show you in my talk and give you an overview, and that might be a way to better understand this brain-mind relationship. So here is a beautiful quote, Nikola Tesla, and he lived at the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, and very clever guy. I can highly recommend to look up on Wikipedia. Very sort of eccentric, and I think it's a good role model for Elon Musk, who tries to get into his footsteps. And he said a very good thing. if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. And I could say the same, if you want to find the secrets of brain-mind connection, think in terms of so-so and so forth. And that's exactly what I'm doing, and that's why that is sort of our assumption, that you have similar temporal and spatial phenomena on neural and mental level, meaning that's your connection. Yeah, that's like in the same way the chemical formula of water entails certain liquid properties, the same way spatial and temporal features of the brain entail certain mental features. That's the main idea, and here I think then of course the next question, what do you mean by time and space? Of course, I don't go into all the philosophy, I don't want to bother you with that, but what is important, time and space in neuroscience, in current neuroscience, in particular in the Anglo-American world, there's really cultural differences, is strongly determined as sort of what is called a container view. The brain, we just investigate the neuronal correlates of how we perceive and cognize the external time and space. So how I perceive this room, how I perceive the changes when she moves down, how she takes the camera and takes a photo, and so forth. Yeah. However, there is more to time and space, that the brain itself has its own intrinsic time and space. It has its own time scale. For instance, seismic earth waves have their own time scales. Same here, and that sort of inner time and space of the brain matches and more or less may correspond with the time and space of the external world. So that here you have an inner time and space matching with the outer time and space. And I'm interested in this inner time and space because I deem that key for mental features. So then you might say, what is inner time and space? How can we measure it? That's, of course, the key question for a neuroscientist. And that, for instance, so you can measure it, the kind of waves. Yeah, here you have big waves, you have slow waves, and you have faster waves. And all you know when you go to the seaside, slower waves are much more powerful than the faster waves. So, and you can measure that dynamic. There are various tools in engineering and physics by means of which you can measure that relationship, and you will see several examples of mine. And then you have the neuronal activity in the brain. This is a raw time series. You can decompose this into different frequencies. Yeah? And again, I'm looking towards physics and engineering here. Then, so basically what I show you now, I will not dwell much on this slide here. Basically now I show you how the spatial topography of the brain, the overall spatial organization of its neuronal activity and its dynamic, when the slow, fast fluctuations, how those shape mental features. So let me go for the first example, the sense of self. What do you mean by self? When you wake up in the morning, you probably look into the mirror and you see yourself. And usually you recognize, it's me. And then you have a certain sense, it's me. You feel it's me. However, as a psychiatrist, I know that can go awfully wrong. So in my life as a psychiatrist, I encountered various celebrities. These included Jesus, Mao. I've never seen patients here in Russia, but I assume these kind of patients would probably take on the identity of Russian celebrities, like former presidents or head of states or former tsars. So there is, interestingly, a certain cultural component to it. So the question is, how does your brain construct your sense of self? And here I show you what we did. There are various investigations in neuroscience where you compare the, let's say, pictures of yourself with pictures of another person. Or you have to be aware of your own body, let's say your heart rate, your own heart rate, and you have to count and be aware of your heart rate. And what we did, so we compared all these different imaging studies, and we found that you have different layers of yourself. You have an interoceptive self. So the interoceptive self is basically your own inner bodily state. Is your respiration, your breathing, your heart rate, or when you have stomach problems after you drank too much alcohol or vodka, and things like that. Then you have your so that's sort of your interoceptive self, your inner bodily self. Then you have your outer bodily self. So it's tactile, you touch the other person, you experience yourself in space. Sometimes you have body illusions that maybe you have the feeling you're not completely in your own body. And that, you see, induces another set of brain regions, somewhat distinct from the interoceptive regions of the self, but also overlapping. For instance, here, the insula, which is a very key region here on the outer surface of your brain, is also involved in extroceptive processing. And then you have sort of the kind of stimuli when you recognize yourself. So you hear a story, you see a picture of Moscow, and you say, this is highly self-referential for me. Whereas if you see a picture of Ottawa, where I'm living, this is not self-referential at all, and that induces activity changes here in what we call these, in the middle of the brain, cortical midline regions, or also default mode network. So you see that you have different aspects of self, intro, extroceptive, mental. They somewhat recruit different regions. However, they are also closely related to each other. So the regions from the interoceptive processing, like the insula, occur also in the extroceptive processing. So your inner self is linked to your outer self through the insula. And that, in turn, the insula appears again on the mental level. So that basically provides the glue between the different layers of self. And you see here the regions from the extroceptive are sort of recapitulated on the mental level. So and now, this reminds you probably of something. And I always invoke this example, and you will see several images of that. It's like the Russian dolls. Yeah? You have a larger Russian doll, it nests or contains the next smaller one, and so forth. Yeah? And of course, when you look a little bit further east, you have also what is called the Chinese crystal balls. These are all little crystal balls, different sizes, same shape, all nested within each other. So I don't know. So the brain is really, and you will see this again and again throughout my talk, the brain is like a Russian doll. Yeah? Different dolls are nested within each other. However, and now I show you an example, that nestedness can go wrong. That's also on the temporal level. Remember, I invoked the example of the slow and the fast waves, that the slow waves are much more powerful than the fast waves. And that's what you can see here when you, for instance, plot it. So here you have the frequency. This is faster frequency. This is slower frequency. This is power, more power, less power, meaning the slower frequencies are much more powerful than the faster frequencies. You know this when you go to the seaside. So, and now, what is this image? I don't want to go into detail here, but what you can see here, that the relationship, the balance between your slow and your fast waves is related to your self-consciousness. The more slower waves you have, the more powerful your slower waves are, the more powerful your self-consciousness, the stronger. Whereas if you have more stronger fast waves, your self-consciousness is less. So again, you see sort of a temporal nestedness here. Yeah? Again, that's why I invoke it, but now in the temporal domain. So your brain is really a nested organ. If you want to have another comparison, it's really the surfer is like the self, and the self prefers the big and powerful waves. Why? Because you surf much better. They give you more power in surfing. So now, what happens if these waves, these slow waves, become unstable? Yeah, very simple. Your mental self also becomes unstable. And then you develop anxiety. So literally you can see this. This is a study where we showed that sort of remember the upper regions of your mental self here in the midline or the fault mode network of the brain, they become unstable in patients with anxiety disorder. So you can measure that with what is called insufficient functional connectivity within these midline regions. And that sort of unstable mental self, for the specialists among you, functional connectivity in the brain is the highways between the different regions. And that basically is strongly based on the waves of the brain. So now, when you have sort of this unstable slow waves, yourself is unstable, then how will you react to external stimuli, for instance, social situations? You react too strong. And that's exactly what you can see in the activity of these patients. They react abnormally strong to particular external social stimuli. Why? Because if my own mental self is unstable, then the other one might threaten and make even more unstable my own self. And you become anxious. So this is basically what we show here. So in your resting state, you're pure, you have an unstable social self, and that can be related to decrease in the power of these slow waves and in the midline regions. And then when you are exposed to external input, your brain just completely gets crazy and you become anxious. So meaning you can, through abnormal temporal dynamics and a spatial topography here, the midline regions, temporal dynamics, slow, fast waves, you can sort of predict how the people, how their mental self is and how they might react to external stimuli. So that's one example of how, for instance, your brain's spatial organization and temporal organization are key for your mental features. Now I give you another example, consciousness. This, I probably skip this, but one key feature here is consciousness, goes back to Descartes in Western philosophy, has always been associated with specific feature. It's a mind as distinguished from the body. Why? Because you cannot perceive the mental features in outer time and space. Yeah, I can perceive the microphone, but I cannot perceive your feeling, your experience. Yeah, I cannot see that. So that's why the Western people have always assumed, oh, there's something special about it. And that is continued in our time, that many current neuroscientific theories of consciousness really assume special properties, like integration, integrated information theory, global neuronal workspace, recurrent processing, just to name a few, and this is summarized in this one. But however, maybe consciousness is just based on the most basic and fundamental features of the brain, meaning time and space. How does the brain organize its own inner time and space? So this is why we developed this one here, temporal spatial theory. I don't want to bore you with that, but I want to go right ahead into one of the key features. One key feature of your consciousness is that you integrate different time scales. So you can follow this, but then you also follow my movements. Yeah? So this is a very fast time scale, and this is a slow time scale. And you can integrate them. You do not perceive them as completely different in your consciousness. Another, probably much better example is like music. Russian composers like Prokofiev, Shostakovich are masters in making you perceive different time scales as integrated, homogeneous. Particularly Prokofiev. It's unbelievable how he does it. Yeah? So meaning these composers know your brain in a way much better than I do. So the question, how is that possible? How is it possible that we integrate in our consciousness slow time scales and fast time scales? See, I even have difficulties of coordinating them. How is that possible? And that's why I say your brain does it for you. So in philosophy, it's often called the unity of consciousness. Yeah, you experience different time scales, different features of the music in a unity. Yeah, so and that's why here we call temporal-spatial nestedness. You already seen this. The brain has different waves: slow waves, fast waves. You can have the balance. Slow waves are more powerful. Faster waves are less powerful. So, and now the question is this balance between the slow waves and the fast waves related to your consciousness? This is exactly what we see here. So this is an example of when you're in deep surgical anesthesia. So you undergo surgery, you know, the doctors put you into sleep, and you can measure that in brain imaging technique. And here you can see, so this what we call power spectrum. Again, you already know this frequency down here, fast, slow frequency, power, a lot of power, less power. And you see, this is a typical picture. Here's a red curve. Are the healthy subjects, healthy, awake state, before you go into anesthesia. And you see a lot of power in the slow waves and less power in the faster. So meaning you have a certain structure in your power spectrum, as we say. So now, when you're in anesthesia, this is completely flat. So remember, this compares to the seaside when nothing is happening, no waves at all, is completely dead. It's still lake or sea, nothing is happening anymore. Yeah? Meaning your neuronal activity is sort of relatively silent. It has no changes, no fluctuations anymore. So this is what we symbolized here. So in the healthy state, you have a certain structure. You have more power in the longer time scales and in the less power in the faster time scales, and that really applies. And you have different Russian dolls in different sizes. And however, when you start losing consciousness, like in sleep, initial stages of sleep, which we call N1 or N2, then suddenly the slower frequencies become more prominent, as you can see here, and the faster, the minutes, seconds, milliseconds, are much less compared to here. Now, when you lose consciousness completely, it's blank. You don't have any differentiation anymore. Yeah? You do not have a difference between slow and fast. Everything is the same. And that's what we assume, what people also perceive. So you have temporal nestedness, differentiation between slow and fast. And when you lose that, you lose consciousness. So no differentiation of the different frequencies or doles. Now, same on the spatial side. So you have a global brain activity, and out of that, you can your brain differentiates different regions and networks. Very important. That's what you can see here. So this is just, again, like you have one big dole, then you open it, comes a slightly smaller one, and you open that one, yet another smaller one. So you have a continuous spatial differentiation. When you lose consciousness, you lose that spatial differentiation. So everything is, everything is the same. Yeah? So meaning for your consciousness, the more Russian doles of different sizes, the better for your consciousness. However, they need to be integrated. You should not have a smaller Russian dole which completely disappear within the big one. Yeah? So you need to have a certain structure like here. And again, the Chinese crystal balls, similar. So now you say, yes, my consciousness is much more than just different time scales. My consciousness is also that I experience myself as part of the world. Yeah? So I'm experience myself relative to my context. So now you say, how is that possible? Yeah? So meaning your brain must somehow connect to its environmental context and then also to your own body. How is that possible? So that can be called is an alignment. Your brain synchronizes with its environmental context. This is, for instance, shown here. So how does it do it? When you perceive music, when you listen to music, you spontaneously tap the rhythm of the music. So somehow your brain synchronizes with the rhythm of its external environment. And that's exactly what the brain does. It continuously synchronizes. It's like two dancers. It continuously synchronizes. And that's key for your consciousness. So how does the brain do it? For instance, again, Prokofiev. You listen to Prokofiev music, and you have completely different time scales, slow, fast, and he mixes them all, and then, of course, on top of all the harmonies, and he mixes it all and integrates, and somehow your brain can make sense of that. It's unbelievable. Yeah? So how is that possible? So your brain has different time scales by itself. It has so-called temporal windows. For instance, when you look, you cannot see this, but in the back of you, this room has smaller and larger windows. And your brain has a multitude of windows through which basically you perceive the external environment. Yeah? So here, for instance, this camera has a very small window, so it will determine how the camera will picture and photograph me. Thank you for the example. So now, if she were pulling out a larger camera, she would picture me in a very different way. Yeah, she would get me much more context, and I would not be as big, but the context would be much more if the angle of the camera would be good. I didn't ask her to do this. Thank you very much. Good timing. Your time scales are perfect. So, and that's exactly what our brain does. It has a multitude of time scales through which basically the world is filtered, and we perceive the world. Yeah? And interestingly, in our brain, we can measure these time scales. That's a fascinating thing called here autocorrelation function. You don't need to know this. And here you see, for instance, there was a brain. The brain, different regions of the brain have different time scales. So we have a multitude of time scales, absolute key. And for instance, here, these are real data. When your time scales are normal, you have faster, shorter time scales, longer time scales. You're able to perceive things in a very precise way. For instance, these two guys, look, there's the temporal dynamics. You need a long time scale to integrate the two, meaning to make the relationship between the police and the thief. But you also need short time scales to distinguish them. If you only have short time scales, you cannot link the two, so you say these are unrelated events. But if you only have long time scales, you will put them together and you cannot distinguish them. So this is your awake state. These are real data. This is real data-based. And then when you become drowsy, when you sleep, your time scales become sort of a little longer. Yeah? Your time scales become longer, so meaning there's not such a fine-grained temporal resolution anymore. Yeah? So meaning you cannot distinguish as fine-grained between different time points anymore. Yeah? So and then what happens to your perception? It becomes more blurry. You can see also the listening here, the auditory is not as clear anymore, and the perception becomes a little more blurry. Now, imagine your time scales get even longer and you don't have any shorter temporal windows anymore in your brain. So everything is just integrated into one larger window. That's what happens when you get deeper into sleep. So the picture becomes much more blurry, as you can see here, and also what you hear becomes sort of more blurry, less distinguished. Now, when you lose consciousness completely, this is what you hear. You have extremely long time scales, like in anesthesia or in coma. You have extremely long time scales. What happens? You cannot differentiate anymore. Everything is put one together. So if she has a huge, big camera, that will take a photo where I cannot be distinguished from the background anymore. Yeah? That's basically the state, and then you lose consciousness. So you forgot that camera, to bring that camera. Yeah? So that's really a key. And that indeed, this is based on data, meaning that the number of temporal windows in your brain is absolutely key, because sort of you match the time windows of the brain with the time windows. You match the time windows of the brain with the time windows of the environment. Yeah? So the composer of music like Prokofiev or Shostakovich or Khachaturian or others know exactly somehow the time scales of your brain, and then they can play with that in their music. Yeah? So it's a continuous, it's like dancing. You try to match yourself to the music. Typical example, and that's what we do. Now, when you have different conscious states, I gave you an overview here, like you're in awake, or you take some psilocybin or other psychedelics, or schizophrenia, or you're sedated, anesthesia. So you have different degrees of time scales. Why? You have different kinds of interfaces with your environment. Yeah? So this is the way, let's say, if you have only very long time scales, you will perceive me completely different and what I say compared to somebody who has only short time scales. So you will yield different kinds of meanings. Now, that is even more important. There's a lot of discussions, do other species, non-human species, animal, dogs, cats, etc., do they have consciousness? I would say, yes, look into their time scales. Every dog owner knows the dog has a certain consciousness, but maybe the consciousness is more restricted. So here, this is a schematic thing, but something we want to tackle in our empirical investigation. For instance, you see the mouse has a limited number of time scales, the cat more, monkey, and human. So meaning these different species perceive the same environment in a different way. Remember the example with the different cameras. Same here. And in philosophy, some of you may know, there's a lot of discussion about, there's a famous paper, what is called the bat. What is it like to be a bat? And the bat has ultrasonic waves. We cannot perceive, as humans, we cannot perceive these ultrasonic waves. But the bat can. So meaning the bat has very different time scales here compared to us. So the bat will perceive a slightly different segment of the world, the same world it shares with us. So it's basically different time scales, different interfaces or perspectives upon the world. So, almost come to an end. Last example. When you're depressed, what happens? So, why are we depressed? The idea is maybe that, and you know that when you're depressed, everything is too slow. The patients tell you that. Nothing moves for them. Their stream of consciousness is very slow, and it's dragging, and nothing happens for them. That's the way they move, they speak, and they cannot get up. They're not motivated at all. And of course, imagine that state, how would you feel? You'd be depressed. You'd be very sad. Nothing happens anymore. Why is that so? The opposite state is what we call mania. In mania, you're very active, you don't need to sleep, you walk around like crazy, and you talk very fast and blah, 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 blah. So, there apparently, you're too fast. And that's what patients also tell you. So, and of course, if you have a certain degree of fastness, it gives you a kick, because you don't know to sleep, you become creative, everything is faster, and you're in a good mood. So, however, it becomes too much, and then you need to see a psychiatrist. So, question, where is this abnormal slowness in depression and this extreme fast speed? Sorry, now I'm running away here from all these pictures. So where does this come from? The idea is maybe your brain's activity is also too slow or too fast in these guys. So this is what can be investigated. So, and this is an important thing because, again, remember, at the beginning I spoke of inner and outer time. Inner time is your brain's, your mind's time. outer time is the external time. Yeah? So what I perceive, yeah? Yeah, you're now moving, so you're moving fast and try to match that time scale with my own inner time scale. Now imagine, it's my own inner time. Can you run again, please? No, it's not serious. Go ahead. So imagine if my inner activity, thank you, my inner activity is too slow. I could not follow her. Yeah, my inner activity is too slow and I cannot follow her. So I try desperately to follow her movements and I'm extremely stressed. Yeah? So if you continuously perceive fast things, you'll be stressed. So now if my inner time is too slow, meaning I'm here, yeah, I have real problems of following her. Yeah? Because I'm constant, so I experience an objectively okay movement as extremely fast because my inner time is too slow. Yeah? And in Mania, it's the opposite. So if she were moving along again here, then I would say, oh, she's too slow. Why are you slower? Why are you not faster? So meaning inner and outer time are desynchronized in depression and mania. I'm too slow and I'm too fast in mania. So now, this is basically what is here. Everything is relative, and that's the key point for our brain. The brain always processes inputs relative to itself. If the inner brain is too slow, the outer inputs, the outer time when she moves along, is perceived as extremely fast. So you're desynchronized. Yeah? You're always dancing too slow relative to the rhythm of the music. Yeah? And that's the case, what you see in depression. Yeah? Because your inner time is too slow, the outer time is perceived as too fast. Yes? Because relative to your slower inner time, the outer time, when she moves along here, there's again somebody moving. Now she stops because she knows I'm too slow, I cannot follow her. Then, of course, I change. So that's the key. Now the question is, that's sort of your consciousness, your time consciousness. And your inner time consciousness relative to your outer time speed. So now, of course, the $1 million question is, how is that related to your brain? Yeah, to your brain's time speed. So the idea is maybe your inner brain time speed is also too slow. So the question, first you need to see, how can you measure the speed of time of neuronal activity? So that's, of course, now the real empirical question, because you want to measure that. Yeah? So how can you measure time speed? What is time speed? It's change. Yeah? She changed her position. She was a little faster, changed her position more often. And probably I should not turn my back to you now. So, and so now she's changing her position again. So how can I measure that? I can measure the variability of her, the variance of her position. Yeah? So she changes her position, and by the degree of change of position, I can infer the speed. So, and you can measure that with what is called neuronal variability. Yeah? So how much she changes her position in the brain, it's more how much the amplitude of the activity changes over time. So this is what we call neuronal variability. Now you say, yeah, how then do we can measure inner and outer time speed? What is outer time? So inner time is your very inner time. Remember your self. Remember the regions of the self I indicated? And they also included the sensory motor network. And the sensory motor network is the regions here where by which you move, particularly if you move, and also receive external input. So, and they have been shown to be related to time perception. So maybe they could be a proxy for inner time. Whereas outer time, now where's outer time? So when I perceive here, you really do a good job. So which region in my brain will be active when she walks? My visual cortex. Yeah? So, and the speed with which I perceive her will depend upon the speed of my visual cortex. So meaning the speed within which she moves will be processed in my brain relative to the speed of my visual cortex. So maybe our primary sensory regions are sort of a proxy for our outer time-speed perception, because the visual input is processed relative to what goes on in your visual brain. And so we could really measure that here, visual network regions. So now, remember you had these, I can do this here. So remember this one, you had a discrepancy in the depressed and in the mania. Your inner time was too fast. So now you expect in mania that your inner time also in the somatomotor network is too fast, and you perceive the external environment as too slow. So then you would expect your visual network is also too slow. So the neuronal variability in the neural network is too slow. And that's exactly what we can see here. So these are real data. So you see that your variability, your time speed in your inner time speed regions, the somatomotor cortex, are way too fast compared to the external, to the visual network for the outer time speed in mania. So you have a discrepancy. Inner time is too fast, somatomotor network, too much variability, outer time is too slow. Let me show this in this picture. So usually we have somewhat of a balance in the neuronal variability, this one, between your somatomotor network variability and your visual network. Outer time speed perception, inner time speed experience. Somewhat they balance similar degrees of neuronal variability. Yeah? So that's why I can synchronize, I can follow her, and I do not experience that as extremely stressful. Now, in depression, it's the other way around. So here, my inner time is too slow. I only speak, walk, move like this because my inner time speed is too slow. So now when I have that, and that's what you see here in the sensomotor network, my activity is simply too slow. That's what you see here. This is data-driven. Whereas when she moves, I experience it as way too fast, and that's why my activity in visual network is too fast. Yeah, and increased neuronal variability. I give you an example. I once saw a young patient, 16 years old, and she came into the clinic severely depressed. And depressed, she didn't move and she didn't walk at all. And so she was completely silent, didn't speak. Her mother was with her, and her mother spoke normal speed. So it was very normal, not fast. And then afterwards, when she fortunately recovered, I asked her, "Why didn't you speak?" And she said, "Yes, I had the feeling that my mother was speaking so fast. I knew that she speak normal pace, but for me it was way too fast, so I couldn't follow, so I didn't speak." Yeah? So you see how your inner time speed determines how you perceive the outer. Yeah? So, and you have a disbalance in depression. Then in mania, it's the opposite. The manic patient is, now you need to follow me, your time scales, you need to recruit your faster time scales. The manic people, as I said, they run around like crazy and they speak very, very, very fast. So then for them, the outer time, and that's what you can see here, again, they have too much variability in the somatomotor network. Yeah? Whereas their activity change, their speed in the visual network is too slow. So meaning for the manic patients, Their brain is too fast and the environment is too slow for them. That has huge implications, which I do not spell out here, for building artificial agents. If you want a robot or an artificial agent, you need to build in certain timescales. And currently, they lack those timescales. They just have one timescale for one particular task. So they're extremely good in specific tasks, but they're not good at adapting to different tasks. You call this the generalization problem. Yeah? So, and it's also the kind of time scales you build into the robot will strongly shape how the robot will behave in its environmental context. So if we build in very, very slow time scales into the robot, but not faster time scales, the robot may be very good at yielding time scales over with a long time scale required, but not good in solving faster tasks. So, as I said, remember earlier, the time scales are the interface with your environment. So it's the key problem. If you build in faster or slower time scales, maybe we need to adapt our time scales to the time scales of the robot in order for us to be able to interact with the robot. So this is not a trivial question, and extreme instances of that mismatch in time scales you see in psychiatric disorders. Yeah? Yeah, I come to the conclusion. I think it's clear that maybe time and space, maybe they provide a possible link between neuronal and mental features. So your mind is basically, essentially, temporal-spatial. Yeah? So a physicist has no problem understanding that, because for them, nature and reality have basic spatial properties and basic temporal properties, particularly time. Of course, now don't ask me for the relationship between time and space. I would probably argue that time is first and time shapes space. But I leave that for the physicists or the mathematicians to solve that puzzle. So again, and even more important, you can measure that in the brain. It's not just one philosophical theory, but you can measure that. You can measure that with specific measures of spatial topography, temporal dynamic, which are not currently mainstream, but which has a long tradition in your history of neuroscience and how to measure that. And if you go into dynamic systems theory in physics and mathematics. So meaning, if you're interested in studying the brain in the future, I can only strongly recommend you, yes, study neuroscience, but also study mathematics or physics or engineering. Yeah, so that kind of combination, and my group is completely mixed of all these different disciplines. There are also some psychologists in there, but that is really key, because that prepares you much, much better, and then focus on nonlinear system, dynamic systems. And I do really think that we can learn a lot from nature. Thermodynamics, yeah, you'll see a lot of those principles, and then of course we also want to have, as I was speaking with my predecessor here, the previous speaker, we need the mathematics for that. Yeah, so we have one attempt where we try to look consciousness and brain formalizes in terms of category relations. So I can only recommend that. So let me just second to last slide. So what we currently do is really we investigate the brain, and then, then we say, okay, this is somehow, we have all these different functions, and we look for the neuronal correlates of these functions. Yeah, we investigate attention, perception, working memory, different forms of attention, and so on, executive functions. However, there's a gap. That really has not been related to mental features, sense of self, consciousness, free will, emotional feeling, and so forth. And I just touched a little bit upon consciousness and self. It's a huge Pandora box. We have a gap here. Yeah, remember initially I told you about a gap of contingency. Same thing here. That is the current state of neuroscience, which is a very cognitive-oriented, affective, cognitive, social neuroscience. Yeah? And the problem is, how can we close that gap? You already heard me a little bit. look for spatial-temporal neuroscience. Look for brain dynamics. Brain function is driven by dynamics. The way the waves at the seaside serve for you as a surfer to surf very well depends upon the dynamics of the waves and how well you can align to that dynamics. Yeah? So, and that's key. So brain dynamics shapes and constitutes brain function. And that is often overlooked. And I strongly believe that there is a cultural difference. So when I would present this in the Anglo-American world, where I'm currently living, they would not understand, for instance, dynamics. Dynamics is change from time point to time point. It's relative. However, when you look at their views, they always just consider single time points, discrete time points. But that eliminates the temporal continuity. You see that in the method parts of their paper. But that dynamic is key. Yeah, and I would argue, I showed you, that also then provides the link to the mental features. And I hope I gave you at least a little bit idea of how I hope maybe this brain-mind connection sort of can be revealed and maybe cracked, and that involves a strong view also of novel models of the brain, and I think your tradition is perfectly suited for that. Thank you very much, and I close with that. So main message, temporal dynamic, spatial topography, connect brain and mind, and if we understand that, we can also provide much better therapy and diagnosis for psychiatric disorders, which so far really is purely subjective in trial and error. Thank you very much, and I wish you a happy Science Day.
Веб-сайт профессора Нортхоффа, вы его видели сейчас.
You've seen the website of Professor. You can find in the excerpt from his lecture on the website of our festival. If you look at this picture, you will find other lectures of our dear guest, and we'll read them. You will find a lot of interesting things. We have a 15 minutes break, and then we have a lecture from Professor Anokhin.
It's good in time. Okay. Point of you to organize. It's wonderful.